In this video, I'll demonstrate a blending technique that changed the way that I paint. I first demonstrated on a simple black and white gradient, and then I go on to demonstrate it within this painting, within the coffee mug and in the lemon. The typical approach to blending goes something like this. You pick up the first color and you put it down on one side. Then you pick up the second color and put it on the other side. Then you mix the two colors together and you just sort of scrub them until they look smooth. So I'm moving side to side and I'm picking up some of this white, and I'll have to wipe some of this paint off so I can get into the pure white. Change brushes so it has pure white on it, and work into the gray area. And you keep working it until you get it pretty smooth. So I'll just work on this for a little bit. Then you can take like a soft brush and try to smooth it out even further. This approach works, but there are some issues with it. For one, I don't feel like I have too much control over the gradation here. I feel like maybe the black goes too far over here, and this doesn't really smooth out as much as I'd like it to. I can go back in and rework that if I want to. I could try pulling the white over towards the center so that it lightens up more towards the middle. And I could pick up more of the white paint and work it in there. So you get the idea that you blend two colors together and you sort of figure it out as you go. There's a second approach that I call band blending, and it's a little bit different. The whole idea is that I split this up into 5 sections, and those will be 5 separate colors. So this will be white, this will be black, and then I'll have 3 shades of gray that I can mix up. I'll start by mixing what looks like a middle gray. Then I can make a lighter and darker version of that gray. This will be the darker version. Needs a little bit more white. Might help to put pure black on the side so you have something to judge this dark gray against. I'll mix the lightest gray and I'll start with a big blob of white and then add it to some of this gray. I'll move these colors over just so that it makes more sense. I rearranged it so they're all in order. I have pure white, light gray, middle gray, dark gray, and then pure black. That corresponds to what I have on my square. I'll start by painting in the pure white, and it's super easy to tell where this is supposed to go. So there's the pure white. I rinse my brush off, and now I can pick up the light gray. And I'll paint the gray right next to it. It doesn't have to be perfect. If you're using oils, you could just go straight across, because this would take forever to dry. But since these are acrylics, I'll take a brush and start blending these two together. This is easier to blend because the step between this white and light gray isn't as big as going from black to white. You could do the same thing where you wipe off your brush, or you could pick up some of the lighter color and put it in there. I have that pretty much blended. Now I'll pick up the middle gray. Let's paint this in as a stripe, and it does help if the edges are touching like this. One advantage to this technique is that you're working on small segments at a time. It's not like you put 2 colors down and there's a race to scrub these together. You can take your time working on small sections. This is a softer mop brush, and I can do circular motions to work these colors into each other and then go back and forth. I'll work my way across this. I just have to do the dark gray and the black. You can always go back into the main color if you need to bring back some of the darkness. And finally, I'll put in the pure black. This is basically done. I feel like I could smooth that out a little bit, but you can see how you could work on this in sections. And if you need more of the middle gray, you could just grab it from here and put it in the middle. With this technique, if you want to come back and touch it up, you'd have to like mix this gray up and hope it's the right shade. Whereas this approach gives you graduated steps, and that's the whole idea behind what I call band blending. Both of these blending techniques worked, but I do feel like this is a little bit more consistent. You can see there's more pure white on the left-hand side, and I think the gradient from the gray to the black is a little bit smoother. You could go back in and rework either one, but I feel like this is more strategic. And the thing about blending demos is that you rarely ever have a spot in your painting that's wide open like this. Usually a gradient falls within a shape, and it's hard to take a brush and just go back and forth real quick like that. If you put the colors down next to each other, no matter what the shape is, you can always soften the edge between them. And that gives you more control because you paint in the bands of color and they stay there, and you just soften the edges between them. I worked in printing and graphic design starting in the late 1990s. Back then, computer software and hardware isn't as good as it is today. And there was an issue with gradients in software like this where you would get banding. I've recreated it here. I had to exaggerate some things in order to get this to happen. But if you look at this, you can see this gradient is made up of solid stripes. There's also an illusion here where it looks like it's lighter here and darker on this side, but that's just because of the colors that are next to it. That's called fluting. That's another topic. Maybe I could explain that in another video. But the important part here is that the software creates gradients by having solid stripes of color next to each other. Most people would complain about this issue, so the solution that engineers came up with is to dither it. Now, this is Affinity Designer, and this is in the settings, and if I hit the dither, that does smooth it out quite a bit. You still get a sense that there's some banding in here, but I have the contrast turned way up, and that exaggerates the effect. So I'll just turn this on and off. You can kind of get a sense here of what that does. Now, with it turned on, if I zoom in, you can see that it creates like this stipple pattern. This is still a solid stripe, but it puts these dots in here into the stripe next to it. So in a way, that's like blending or blurring the edge here like I did in my demo. I took a soft brush and I made circular motions to drag one color into the color next to it, and that softens it. So anyways, that gave me the idea to try that with painting, where you could just paint stripes next to each other and then drag one color into the color next to it. It's funny, what used to frustrate me with computer graphics ended up becoming a solution in painting. So I'll get set up and I'll start a drawing, and then I can show you how that works. I've explained my drawing process in another video, but the basic idea is I draw a grid with watercolor pencil and I draw with acrylic markers. The markers are different than like a solvent-based marker. They're compatible with acrylic paints, so the marker won't bleed through the paint. When I'm done and the acrylic marker is dry, I could just wipe off the grid with water because the watercolor pencil is water soluble. Here's my reference photograph for the painting. You can download all my reference photographs for my paintings by signing up for my free email newsletter. There's a link to it in the description below. So one thing you'll notice right away is this is totally different than painting a swatch on a piece of paper. In my demo, it was just a square and it had masking tape around the outside, so it was super easy to blend it. But you can see the reality of trying to blend within a painting. There's gradients within complicated shapes. And that's why I feel like this technique is helpful, is because it allows you to break a section down into segments and paint them in as flat colors. That way you just soften the edge between it. In the demo, I used 5 different segments for the different shades of gray and the black and white. You could draw in the separate segments, but once you get the idea of it, you can just sort of segment it off in your mind and paint in the first color, paint in the second color, and then paint in the last color. And it doesn't have to be segmented into 5. It could be whatever you think will work for that transition. I'll start by mixing the color along the edge. It's fairly neutral, and then it gets warmer as it progresses towards the left. So as I said, I'll probably do 3 colors, a color right here, one in between, and then this warmer brown color. I'll start off with ultramarine blue and the purple red, and maybe a touch of this cadmium yellow primrose. It needs to go lighter, and it has more blue in there. So definitely a lot lighter. It's pretty close. I think it has to go slightly lighter. That's the thing about creating realistic effects and smooth blends, is getting the colors right. If you don't have an accurate color mix, it's not going to look realistic. Color mixing is a skill that you should work on developing. I have a course that covers the basics of color mixing. There's a link to it in the description below. That's not too bad for the edge right there. Now for the in-between color, I'll probably start with the blue and some of the ultramarine. A little bit of white to lighten it up, and I think it has to go warmer because of the pink background and the color of the tea. This isn't close, I just need to compare it though. So I'll put more of the magenta in there and a little bit more of the ultramarine. It's not bad for this section. The other thing you can do is mix these two together so you have an in-between color that you would paint in between there. So maybe I'll do that before I get started. But I would like to get a little bit of a darker section here. It's actually not bad, maybe just a hair darker, but that's pretty close. Just some fine tuning here. I think that's close enough for like this section right there. I could always dip into more of these colors to adjust it. So as I said, I'll take some of this and mix it in with this darker burgundy color, so I have like an in-between shade. I don't need a ton of this either because it's such a small segment. I'll start off with this purplish gray color and paint it in on the right hand side of the mug. So I just left the hard edge on the left side of this. I rinse my brush off and I'll pick up some of this in-between color. I could even dip it into this if I wanted to, and I'll just fill it in right next to it. I have pencil lines drawn in there, but I would just normally do this by eye. If you're working in oils, you could lay all these colors out and it would stay wet for a couple days probably. So you could do it in segments where you paint the stripes in and then you blend it. But since these are acrylics, you can just smooth it out as you paint. And that's where you can like mix in some in-between colors. In fact, I think some of this color needs to go further to the right. That's the thing, is you can make these adjustments as you go. I find that once you fill things in and you fill in the rest of the painting, you might come back in and move this over a little bit. But if you have extra color left on your palette, it's not such a big deal. You could just dip into it and work into it. Here's the darker color. This brush has soft bristles, so it's kind of hard to push the paint around with it, but it's good for blending. So now I can just soften this edge and work the color in there. I'm realizing I'm painting this too far down. This here will be a darker shape, but that's fine. I'll paint over that with a darker color and it'll be fine. You see how this progresses? It's not like I'm putting in these colors in here and racing to blend them. I do a segment, blend it, do a segment and blend it. This works really well for acrylics because acrylics dry quickly and you can work on one section at a time. I'll take the darkest color and work on that section next. This color could go a little bit further over and then it starts to transition into like a warmer orangey color. And this is where you don't have to be so rigid with this technique. You can sort of figure it out as you go along. So for example, I could mix some orange in here. This is cadmium orange. I could take a little bit of the orange and maybe a dash of this pyrrole red. It's pretty close. I'll just put that in here or over here and just blend it into the darker section. If any edge doesn't look smooth enough, you can just drag the color next to it into it, like I'm doing here. I think it looks better. So you can see how I could build up a gradient fairly quickly. I do feel like I got way too much gray over here, but as I said, you could just go back in and add some of those colors in there. I'm just adjusting this so that the gray doesn't go too far into the color. It gets a little more orangey on this side, so I added more orange. Right here, there's a dark shadow. I'll just leave that blank for now, and I'll just continue on with this orange color. I feel like this approach is more practical because most paintings have these odd shapes that you have to work within, and you can't really mask them off with tape. There's less pressure, and you have more control over where each color lands within the transition. I mixed up burnt sienna and carbon black to make this darker brown color. And I'll use that for this section here. There is a gradient, but it's very subtle, and the darkest part's right here in the middle. I'm painting this part right here, and you can see this gets a little bit more warm on the left-hand side. So as I said, you don't need to be super rigid about this. You can just adjust it as you go. I'm adding more of the magenta to it, maybe a touch of the red. And I'll just fill it in on the left-hand side. And where they meet, you just soften that edge. So this shape here gets lighter on the right-hand side. I'm just painting that in. And I can pick up some of this darker color and paint a shape right next to it. I can soften this edge, wipe off my paintbrush to get rid of the extra paint, and then soften this edge. It might help to pick up some extra paint and work it in there while you're softening the edge. I'm going to use the same techniques to paint the areas of the T in this part of the cup. And one thing to keep in mind is that it doesn't have to be a stripe, it could just be a shape. So the stripes work for areas like this, which are mostly linear, but there's other sections where you could just paint in shapes next to each other and soften the edges. And this shape is more organic. Like I said, it connects to other areas, like it goes underneath this handle, and this darker brown color goes into this section. And then I could just pick up one of these lighter brown colors. I think it actually needs more red or orange in it. And like I'm doing here, sometimes you could paint over that edge and it'll blend it all at once. So the edge is a little bit soft because both sections were wet as I painted over them. You can also come back in with smaller shapes on top of this. You can either let it dry or paint it in now when it's wet. I like to get the big shapes in first, then come back in and refine it. I'm going to go ahead and fill in some of these other areas. One thing I noticed is that most paintings don't even need that much blending. For example, there's some areas on the right here which are just basic flat areas of color. And that ties in with my video about the no blending painting technique, where I just break everything up into hard edge shapes, mix the color and fill it in, and then it creates a realistic effect. It looks a little bit more stylized because the edges are hard, but it proves the point that you don't really need to do that much blending in a painting. In fact, a lot of these shapes within this handle and along the edges, are probably going to be painted in the same manner, where it's mostly just a flat area of color. So you really just need blending in some really strategic locations, like on this glass right here. So the next step is I'll fill in the rest of the background, and I'll start working on the shadow. I'm using quinacridone magenta for the background color. At first, I thought I would use it as a glaze because it makes it more brilliant. I discussed that in my previous video about how to make acrylics more vibrant. One of the main points I made in that video is that transparent glazes turn out more vibrant than if you were to add white to lighten the color. It's kind of like how transparent watercolors look more vibrant. So what I did is I thinned it out with a little bit of medium and water, but later in the painting I decided to make it more of a solid color. I didn't like the brushiness of the background and I thought it was slightly too vibrant. I used the band blending technique for the lemon too, but it's a little bit different. I didn't really draw out the shapes too much. I just mixed up a couple different shades for this lemon and placed them next to each other. Then I went back in and softened the edges. One of the tips for making it look more realistic is to come back and add a little bit more detail to it. So in this case, I added a little bit more of the highlight details and some of the texture of the lemon. So that's an important thing to keep in mind, is that you can use this technique to create a nice smooth blend, but you need to think about too is like the surface texture of whatever it is that you're painting, and try to figure out different ways you can capture that. As I mentioned previously, I decided to make the background a solid magenta color rather than using a glaze. I think it makes it look more solid or realistic when I paint it this way. Here's the finished painting. I hope you try out this technique. It does seem to help with blending acrylics, and you can even use it for oils. Up next, you can watch my playlist of acrylic blending videos, which includes my no blending painting technique, and you can watch my video about how to make acrylics more vibrant. Thanks for watching.